In this video, I'm going to walk through question number 7 on the genetics in class assignment problem set and show you how you can work through these pedigree problems and come up with the most likely mode of inheritance and then solve the probability questions that you're given. So we always want to start with our decision tree, and specifically what we want to be determining initially when we're confronted with a pedigree is what's the most likely mode of inheritance, because we have to know this in order to then tackle the probability problems, because we have to be able to assign genotypes, right? And so question number 1 that we want to be answering is, does this look like a recessive trait or does it look like a dominant trait? And so remember that with your decision tree, what the key feature that you're going to be looking for to determine if a trait looks like it's recessive versus dominant is the presence of silent carriers. And so what does that mean, silent carrier? That means somebody who has the allele that causes a particular phenotype, but doesn't themselves show the phenotype, which means they must be heterozygous, right? They must also have the dominant allele. So somebody, for example, who is heterozygous has the allele that causes a recessive trait or disease, but since they have a dominant allele, they don't show the phenotype. So they're carrying this recessive allele silently in their genome. And so what does this look like in a pedigree, the presence of silent carriers? Well, what this would look like is that we would have parents who are unaffected, they're not shaded, but they have offspring who may show the disease trait. So one of their offspring is shaded in, so this individual is showing the phenotype. Neither of the two parents is, and so this would be a classic recessive pattern of inheritance. So this individual showing the phenotype would be homozygous recessive. Both parents heterozygous, not showing the trait, but both of them able to pass on this recessive allele and produce this homozygous recessive offspring that does show the trait. So that's what we're looking for. So in evaluating a pedigree, we're going to be looking for silent carriers. If we see any silent carriers, that trait must be recessive, because it's not possible to be a silent carrier for a dominant trait. If a trait is dominant, having even one of those dominant alleles is going to mean that you show the trait, right? So it's not possible to have silent carriers for a dominant trait. So if we don't see any silent carriers, then that's telling us that this trait is most likely to be dominant, especially if this is a rare trait. And I'll always specify if a trait is rare. Once we've made that determination, is it recessive? Is it dominant? Then we can start looking for the patterns of sex linkage, which are different depending on whether the trait is recessive or dominant. So once we've determined that a trait is recessive, we can look for the patterns that are specifically associated with recessive sex-linked traits. And those are a predominance of males being affected by the trait. Since males only have one X chromosome, they don't have a backup X to cover the presence of a recessive allele. So they'll show a recessive trait that's on the X chromosome, even if they only have one copy of it, right? They don't have a backup X. And then the other thing that we see with sex-linked recessive traits is that if we do see affected females, do their fathers also show the trait? So in order for a female to be affected by an X-linked trait, she would have to have 2 copies of whatever that mutation is, right? So she would have to inherit a bad X from mom, a bad X from dad. And so if she inherited a bad X from dad, dad would also have to show the trait. So if we see those patterns, then we would say, yes, that looks like a sex-linked trait. If we don't see those patterns, then we would say, no, that looks more autosomal, right? Now, on the other side, in evaluating a dominant trait, a trait that we've decided is dominant because there are no silent carriers, what we're looking for to determine sex linkage is, do affected males have all daughters affected? So again, we want to be thinking about a male who has this mutation in a gene on the X chromosome, indicated by this asterisk. He's going to pass on that X chromosome to all of his daughters. And so all of his daughters are going to inherit that bad X. So they should all show the dominant trait as well. But since dad is passing on the Y chromosome to his biological sons, then they're not going to show the trait because the Y chromosome doesn't have the same set of genes, right? So if we see this pattern, affected males have all daughters affected but never affected sons, then we would say, yes, that looks like sex linkage for a dominant trait. If we don't see that pattern, then we would say that looks autosomal. So this is the decision tree that we're going to be applying as we're evaluating pedigree. So let's tackle the pedigree in question number 7 and apply that logic. So again, very first thing we want to do is determine the mode of inheritance. So which of the following modes of inheritance could explain the pattern observed? Autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, sex-linked dominant, sex-linked recessive. So we're looking for dominance versus recessivity first. And again, what we're looking for is silent carriers. So do we see any examples where someone is affected, is showing this genetic disorder, but neither of their two parents show it? Do we see silent carriers? So if we look at all the affected individuals here, we start down here in generation 4, look back at the parents. Nope, one of the parents has it. Look at her parents. Nope, one of the parents has it. Look at all these individuals in generation 2. Look back at generation 1. Nope, one of those parents have it. So we don't see any silent carriers. So no silent carriers. And therefore, we assume, and again, this is an assumption, that this is a dominant trait. So now we're looking for those patterns of sex linkage. And again, for a dominant trait, the patterns of sex linkage that we're looking for is we look at the affected males showing the trait, and then look at their daughters, because all of their daughters should also show the trait. So let's find the affected males in this pedigree. So here's an affected male, individual 2-5. He's affected by this genetic disorder. We look, he has a daughter. She is not affected. So that does not support the idea of sex linkage. But let's continue looking. We also have a male here, individual 2-7, who has a daughter who is not showing the trait, right? So that's another strike against sex linkage. And then finally, we have individual 4-2, who is an affected male, unaffected daughter. So 3 strikes against sex linkage. So since we have affected males who have unaffected daughters, then we would say that this looks like an autosomal trait. It does not look sex-linked, right? And so what we assume then, based on the pattern we're seeing, is that this is an autosomal dominant trait. Since it's autosomal, it's not on a sex chromosome, we can assign any letter that's convenient for this gene. Doesn't matter. We don't have to keep track of the X's and Y's, right? And so let's use the letter A, just because it's easy to distinguish, capital for dominant and lowercase for recessive alleles, and start thinking about genotypes. So if this is a dominant trait and it's autosomal, we use the letter A. Let's have a look at these individuals and see if we can assign some genotypes. So affected individuals, in theory, could be heterozygous or homozygous dominant to be showing this dominant trait. But if we look back at the parents, sometimes that can allow us to eliminate this homozygous dominant genotype, because if a parent is unaffected by this trait, they must have 2 recessive alleles. So for example, here in generation 4, we have 2 individuals who are affected, and we look and see mom is also affected, but dad is not. So dad must be homozygous recessive to not be showing this dominant trait, which means these individuals must have inherited a recessive allele from dad. Since they're showing the trait, we know they inherited that dominant allele from mom. So we can assign genotypes like so. And we see that same pattern throughout the pedigree, where all of these affected individuals have one parent who is unaffected and therefore must be homozygous recessive, right? And so we can assign genotypes to all of these affected individuals. They must be heterozygous. Now, the only person that we don't have parent information for to assign genotypes like that is this individual 1-1. But if we look at the offspring that this individual has, we see that she has this unaffected child in generation 2, so she must have been able to pass on a recessive allele. So she must also be heterozygous, right? So we can assign genotypes to all of our affected individuals. They're all heterozygous. So now that we have those genotypes assigned, we can start tackling these probability questions. So question B asks, if individuals 3-1 and 3-2 have another child, what is the probability it will be a son who's affected by this disease? And so individuals 3-1 and 3-2, we've already assigned genotypes for. And so we can do a quick little Punnett square here. So the alleles that mom could pass on in her gametes would be either the dominant or the recessive. Dad can only pass on the recessive. He only has the recessive allele to give. And so if we do a little 2x1 Punnett square, we see there are two options for genotypes for their offspring. Affected by the disease, that would be these folks that inherit that dominant allele from mom. So 1/2 would be expected to be affected, and then we multiply by another 1/2 the probability of having a son, a biological male son, as an offspring. And so 1/2 times 1/2 equals 1/4 for that overall probability of a son who's affected by this disease. Question C asks, if individuals 5'2" and 5'3" marry and have a child, what's the likelihood that their offspring will inherit the disease allele? So now we're in generation 5, and we're saying these two distant cousins, 5'2" and 5'3", marry and they have a kid. What's the likelihood that this kid inherits the disease allele that has been segregating in this family? Well, let's look at their genotypes. So they're not showing this dominant trait. Therefore, they must both be homozygous recessive. If they're both homozygous recessive, the likelihood of them passing on the dominant allele is 0, right? They cannot pass on what they don't have. Both of these individuals essentially won the genetic lottery in this family that's segregating this dominant genetic disorder allele. They got lucky, right? This male individual 5'2" just so happened to not inherit that disease allele from dad, and this individual 5'3" is the offspring of a line of individuals who got lucky. This individual 2'7" here did not pass on that dominant allele to his daughter, and so everybody else in this lineage is now safe, right? Everybody else is homozygous recessive, not able to inherit that disease allele because she didn't inherit it. Right? So likelihood that their offspring will inherit the disease allele is 0.